Hi everyone, great to see you this morning. My name's Rebecca Howard and I'm Head of Supplier Relationship Management at Coventry Building Society. And this morning I'm talking about taking net zero into action, the kinds of things that we can all do to engage the stakeholders in the organisation, in getting involved, in having a wider understanding and getting passionate about net zero. When I'm talking about stakeholders, I'm speaking about really any individual or group who's got an interest or an influence in the organisation. For us in the Building Society, this is our colleagues, the employees in the organisation. It includes the suppliers who provide our goods and services. That's the group that I interact with, mostly with my team looking after our supplier relationships. It includes our investors who help contribute to make investment to fund some of the big sustainable projects that we're doing and also some of our IT infrastructure changes. And it also includes our community groups as well. Those are different groups who could be charities or groups in the community that we support. And our largest group of all are customers, some of which we call our members, some of which are customers to us, who could be consumers who are taking out residential mortgages or savings products. They've all got different challenges, concerns and interests, but they're probably all facing very similar climate that they're living within. For all of us, the challenge of inflationary pressures and understanding how we still maintain those relationships with stakeholders despite the cost challenges we're experiencing, the increased scrutiny that many of us are feeling. For us in financial services as a regulated organisation, the pressure to be transparent and to maintain conversations with our external parties is high, and that sense of sort of maintaining a trusted relationship is key as well with our different publics. Everybody has efficiency challenges, looking to take cost out of the organisation and do things in a more effective way. And anyone who's in an environment where there is some sort of policy or rule making, we know that can create red tape, it can slow things down. And so many of our stakeholders are looking for ways to do things in a more speedy and more efficient way. And for lots of our stakeholders, cybersecurity remains their number one concern, really. Our customers want to know their money's safe with us. All of the other stakeholders want to ensure that from a personal perspective and their view as a consumer, whether they're vulnerable or whether they have a particular interest in financial services, they know that that's a trusted environment where they can make decisions for themselves and their families, knowing that they're going to be supported going forward and they're not going to have any concerns about fraud, about identity theft, and about what could happen if the banking industry goes through a large shock as it did over 10 years ago. One of the things we find that can be very useful to start creating a bit of a sense of a narrative is a materiality assessment where we gather the views of those stakeholders. Now, we started doing this more formally a couple of years ago in the organisation, and what you can see on screen here is what we publish in our sustainability report as our materiality assessment for ESG. So this is where across the bottom we have, from a high to very high scale, what our board and our senior managers say are the most important ESG factors to the organisation. And up the left-hand side is the importance to our stakeholders. This is consumers, customers, community groups, colleagues, suppliers, all of these other people that I mentioned that are close to the organisation. We initially have a sort of very broad survey where we have focus groups and different activities to engage stakeholders to understand how we narrow down what are the very high things that are concerning to them in the whole field of sustainability. And from there, we come up with these sort of 50 to 20 possibilities that we then base this survey on. And each year is a slightly different perspective when we sort of plot on the graph what comes out as highest priority. I think the very first year that we did this, it was kind of IT security, IT infrastructure that was the main concern, because people were thinking about the relationship between risk to the organisation and sustainability risk, and about blending those two things together and making sure that the organisation was very focused on making that core to their strategy going forward. You notice this year, sort of top right, managing risk, model resilience, IT security, data security, still maintain those sort of top positions, but we've got a new entrant that appeared of good customer outcomes that links very closely to sort of regulatory concerns about consumer duty, about making sure that consumers are adequately protected, making sure that vulnerable customers have good outcomes as well. And also a constant theme that I think is true for all of our stakeholders, that they want to see us as an organization that has strong ethics, values, and culture. And this is really going to be the wrapper of my presentation, that whilst today, and most of our content is about that journey to net zero and about decarbonisation, I've definitely observed in my role that stakeholders appreciate that broader wrapper of ethics, value, and culture as a kind of vehicle, as a gateway to introduce more topics that are very, very specific to energy in general. Those things are very close to our heart in the Building Society. For us, this goes back to our origins. We had our 140th birthday this year in Coventry Building Society, and we celebrated our start in the city of Coventry. We're literally just a few citizens banded together and found a way of saving together to buy one property when there was a huge amount of financial exclusion. And that built then from savings groups and societies, it really giving people greater power to manage their own finances. And that sort of culture of people having the power to help themselves, getting an opportunity, getting a step up, finding ways in which they can improve their life chances and the wealth for their families and their communities, for us is so closely linked to the wider topic of environment, social and governance, and about how we start the dialogue with our stakeholders about carbon in general. We find it's very useful to have some goals to work to. And so some of the things that we are either working on or have achieved have included what you've got on screen here. So last year we became the very first building society in the UK to become B Corp certified. B Corp is an international not-for-profit organisation that certifies organisations that work to the very highest standards of ethics and responsible business. There's a huge assessment that an organisation called B Labs administers, and it's got several different components to it. Supply chain is one element to it, but it also talks much more widely about every aspect of an organisation's propositions and relationships that it has. And for us, that was a very proud moment. It aligned very closely with our values and culture, but it was also, again, a really important platform that we could start to talk more with our stakeholders about, well, what's involved in being a responsible business. Actually, energy management and the minimization of resource usage is a huge part of that. And so it allowed us another kind of route to continue this dialogue about what our stakeholders, and particularly our colleagues themselves, can do. We use an application in the society called Pawprint, where our colleagues can monitor their own carbon footprint. They talk about their journeys to work, they talk about some of the activities that they might do for hobbies or on a home basis. And it's kind of a sort of incentive scheme where colleagues can get points by sort of logging that. And it's part of a way of our sort of measurement as well about what we're doing in the carbon space. And that was just one small piece of evidence that went towards our B Corp certification. As procurement people, lots of us are studying towards or affiliated with the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. And we as an organisation are institute certified for the CIPS ethics qualification, which ensures that each year lots of us take part in different activities to demonstrate the type of responsible sourcing we're doing. So when all of us are buying goods and services on behalf of the organisation, we have a really rigorous due diligence process where we ask suppliers questions about their approaches to energy management, their carbon footprint, the carbon pledges they have, for example, whether they have science-based target initiatives. And that's part of our accreditation process. Sustainability makes up 20% of the weighting when we choose suppliers. So suppliers get a very clear message that the more they attend to this particular area, the more likely they are to build a long-lasting and a good investment with us as a customer. ISO obviously is a huge part of every organisation getting some form of certification. Last year in our organisation, our supply chain obtained a guidance standard, the ISO 20400 for sustainable procurement, which was specifically about the ways in which we've changed our policies and processes to ensure that the relationships we have with suppliers are with those organisations that align to our ESG values as well. And for the last 3 years, we've been shortlisted for CIPS awards in the space of ESG and supply diversity as well, on the basis of some of these initiatives. And none of this would have been achieved without the input, the buy-in, the support of the stakeholders. It can't just be the procurement team or the ESG analysts who are making this happen. It's the action of the stakeholders. And what I wanted to talk about was kind of where that began, particularly in my space, when maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when we were really just starting our journey as an organization, we had very little sort of infrastructure around the sustainability space. When I came into role as head of supplier relationship management, the very first thing I did was worked with our executive team to introduce a sustainable procurement policy. We aligned entirely with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We thought very closely about the sorts of things from the UN Global Compact that were very relevant to us. And we actually got board approval that the entire organisation would work to that sustainable procurement policy. When I was selling in that concept to lots of our stakeholders, our business owners, these are the budget holders in the organisation who would be interested in commissioning services with suppliers, the logic that I was using was that this would be a great way of being able to continue the narrative to our customers about how some of the products we're selling them, like green mortgages, where you can get cash back to make remediations on your home for energy improvement, are just as much backed up in the supply chain. This isn't just something we're doing for customer propositions. This is something which comes alive in every part of the relationships that we have. And so I got great support for that. We didn't really have any challenges to the sustainable procurement policy. What we're trying to find now is that ways in which we can carry on that dialogue so that when we do notice we've got suppliers who are higher carbon emitters, that we start to think how we can shift those relationships, shift the contracts that we have so that we can do things in a much more sort of low energy way, really thinking about innovative approaches so that we can build those long-term relationships with the suppliers who are the ones in which we know we're going to have value from those long-term relationships. I mentioned the certification, but some of the things that we've done within our procurement team to really embed this kind of passion, because capacity building is always super important. I mentioned you can never do this as a small group. So within our procurement team, we have a sustainable procurement working group who are here with us today in the team. Lots of us are part of the Net Zero Hero conversations. And if you want to have a conversation with any of us about the sorts of things that we've done, you can find us upstairs in the Net Zero Hero space over the next couple of hours. And that sustainable procurement working group is another source of ideas, of passion, of enthusiasm for events. So we go out and evangelize and talk a lot about what we're doing. We experience share with our peers. We talk a lot about ways in which we can engage with the community. And I'll talk a bit about some of the stuff we're doing with those stakeholder groups as well. Our carbon data analysis started probably about 2 years ago when we knew within our sort of scope 3, our supply chain, we had to think about the emissions in that space, that we had a huge undertaking. Like many organisations, we've got hundreds of suppliers amongst many thousands of contracts. And we started to take a spend-based analysis as a simple sort of approach to start with so that we could identify what the sort of critical few was. That linked with us with what we do in the procurement team, an annual sustainability impact assessment, literally working through every single category of spend, whether that's IC software, furniture, all the things that we need to keep our organisation going across our branches and our head office. We look across those and understand where the impacts might be, and where we notice there are high impacts, those are the particular organisations that we really do a deep dive of. We introduce ESG elements, not just in due diligence and in the sort of onboarding process, which is for every supplier, but we also ensure that the ongoing relationships have a sort of ESG element to governance, so that just in the same way as you've got a balanced scorecard that talks about performance and about suppliers' financial conditions and about the strategy and the business products, sustainability features just as heavily in that. So every single kind of budget holder or person who commissions work in the society has those similar conversations with suppliers. They're not sort of side of desk. They're just as important as the delivery performance on a huge IT project as well. I mentioned the sort of 20% of the weighting, and that due diligence sort of carries on throughout the supplier relationship, where we've got our most material suppliers to the organisation. Every year we'll ask them about what changes there are. We try to do this sensitively because no organisation appreciates huge amounts of questionnaires to fill in. So we're doing this sort of real deep dive at first point of contact, and then really just doing a check-in to understand what's changed after that as well. When I talked about colleague and community engagement, our Sustainable Procurement Working Group has a huge amount of initiatives each year. This is an event that we love to support. We also have an annual diverse supplier event where we really think about reaching out to suppliers within our local community. That's any organisation that's within 50 miles of our head office. We really love to find out how we can build relationships with more small businesses. And this year, our event, we're running it in partnership with the Federation of Small Business to really widen that access to small business within the West Midlands. And we also include in that event organisations that are owned and managed by underrepresented groups because they're important demographic for us. They give us kind of access to communities, to ideas, to sort of opinions, which we don't normally have access to, and that can really importantly feed through to our customer area who are looking at kind of new customer demographics. Being able to get that insight from our supply chain is really valuable when we're looking at sort of ways in which we can market to new groups and find new customers as well. One of the things that we do an awful lot in Coventry Building Society is work with local schools. So we work with several partner schools within the city of Coventry that are in areas where there is a high proportion of school children who are on free school meals, lots of young people who are seeking opportunities to take sort of alternative routes into careers. They may not always be thinking about university as an option. And so we run a scheme called Employability where lots of colleagues volunteer to give interview sort of practice and CV writing skills, things like that to young people. We involve our suppliers in that activity as well. So this year our suppliers saw nearly 200 of those young people at their own workplaces. We took some of the students out to workplace visits where some of the students could find out about careers in technology or professional services, learn about apprenticeships, do boot camps in digital skills, ways in which for them as sort of 16, 17, 18-year-olds, they're getting a valuable sort of nugget to put on their CV and also access to kind of some potential routes that they can then make as their next step as school leavers. Lots of those suppliers as well get involved in refurbishment of those schools. We had a large group at the Grace Academy School last year where we refurbished some of the outside and inside areas for the young people, just presenting a more kind of welcoming, supportive space for the students as they progress in their learning journey. And Centrepoint is our corporate charity, and again we invite lots of our suppliers, particularly for those who are on our sort of partnership style relationship, to get involved in activities there. That could be refurbishing hostels where young people are making the step from the streets into work, and it can be also getting involved in running careers fairs where our suppliers run stalls where young people can again find out more about apprenticeships and about some of the free resources that they can access to learn more about some of those career routes. For those, that is crucial in engaging suppliers in the wider sustainability conversation, because if they've come out and talked to some of the young people within the city of Coventry, if they've been into London or Bradford to some of the Centrepoint hostels and they understand what we're trying to do to ensure that youth homelessness is eliminated, they then get this massive sense of buy-in to the set of values and cultures that we have in the organisation. And it's a very small step then to say, and another part of what we're doing is thinking about decarbonisation. This is an aspiration that we've set ourselves to have a zero carbon supply chain by 2030. So when we're talking to them about providing data, about what sort of other pledges that they've made, it's a much easier conversation than quite a sort of cold approach where we say, look, it's just due diligence, just give us the data and then you might or might not be qualified and we'll kind of deselect you on that basis, which is a real turn off to lots of our suppliers. So these sorts of activities that suppliers kind of truly get involved in teamwork can make a big difference. On the governance side, supplier payment sort of remains a huge issue that all of us are working on in the organisation. We've got great payment terms. We pay all our suppliers within 30 days. And so our goal is to really focus on the small business community and kind of accelerate payment to those organisations that are much more vulnerable to sort of cash flow, thinking about how we can speed that up and really working with lots of our sort of business partners to make sure that no organisation is disadvantaged essentially through the payment process, and that remains sort of one of our bigger targets going forward. For our Scope 3 carbon emissions, I mentioned already our sort of net zero journey as an organisation, the aspiration to be net zero by 2040, but in that supply chain bit, bringing that forward to 2030. I mentioned that we'd undertaken that initial analysis, and what we found is that we've certainly got a small group of suppliers that make up the majority of emissions. That's probably true for every organisation. It's just a Pareto analysis of trying to figure out who are your 20% who make up the 80%, so we can have some very, very focused conversations with them that are more specific to the services they provide, as well as talking more broadly about data collection with all suppliers that we're starting from this year. That ongoing conversation about stakeholder engagement we do through lots of different forms. A regular survey of our internal stakeholders and our suppliers that we do once a year, bulletins a couple of times a year, a big strategy event for our supplier once a year, a big corporate event that we run here at the arena once a year, and lots of our suppliers take part in, called The Big Picture. I mentioned our diverse supplier event, but we run an awards event as well, where suppliers can nominate themselves and our colleagues can nominate the suppliers who show up in a whole bunch of different categories. But most importantly, as well as delivery and performance, we have categories specific to community investment, to their green initiatives, and to suppliers who are outstanding as small, local and diverse businesses as well. And just that element of reporting is hugely important. I find it interesting that it's often a kind of build it and they'll come. A couple of years ago, we didn't have a sustainability report at all in the organisation. When it first launched, I was quite keen to talk about what we were doing in the local supplier space. And the minute that was published, it then sort of created a need and a pull where increasingly our stakeholders were asking us at the annual general meeting, our investors were asking us when we were having investor meetings, tell us more about local suppliers, tell us more about your commitment to ensuring that you've got decent wages in the supply chain and that your suppliers have ethical approaches to subcontracting. So I find the more information we provide and the more transparent we are, the greater that kind of desire is and that interest, which is really valuable because increasingly we're finding stakeholders want to find out more about the Scope 3 emissions and what our suppliers are doing as well. So sustainability and sort of reporting is a massive part of this, but also just team building. And if I had to say the most valuable part of stakeholder engagement that we do, it's literally getting out with our colleagues, with our suppliers, with our community groups, just blending together. This massively works in my interest because so many of our huge projects that we do in the technology space involve multiple suppliers where we've got a lot of interdependency and very high risk because of that criticality and reliance. So if I can get those people holding paintbrushes or taking part in an event where they're speaking to young people, I get them just making friends, figuring out what each other's interests are, bonding in a very, very different way so that when they're back in the workplace collaborating on a high-risk project, I know for a fact that they're more likely to go that extra mile for each other because they've built a kind of set of common values that's associated with us. So that sort of team building is massively important, and the sense of inclusion so that every supplier, whether it's a massive multinational and we can support one of their events, or whether it's a small local business who's got 3 customers and we can advocate and show up for them and make sure that we're kind of speaking on their behalf and telling about the good work that we do through case studies, that everyone feels as if they're involved in the discussion and nobody sort of gets left out in this. If you're in our sort of team, we can make that work together and keep growing together. And I think just finally, just the key enablers are all the things I mentioned here, that sense of sort of governance and making sure there's an infrastructure around the whole sustainability conversation, that really high level of transparency and wanting to share and have more conversations, being really authentic, that we're not doing this just because, we say so and it looks good in a headline. It's deeply about who we are as an organisation, that sense of that 140-year heritage and our origins, that commitment to the community that we make year after year, that sense of advocacy for each other and standing out and stepping up for each other, and most importantly, the input from the multiple groups of stakeholders. And the sorts of things we're doing next are just more of the same. Every single year we meet more students, we get more access to young homeless people, we have a chance to involve more local suppliers and more diverse businesses in some of our tender activities, and we just want that sense of growth. There's a huge amount of opportunity here, and I've noticed the greater engagement there is, the more willingness there is from our suppliers to share more information about carbon and get on board with kind of reducing energy in the agreements as well.